Good to be with you this morning. I want to share with you that I thought about the lesson this morning, and in light of Sister Zelma's passing, I wondered if maybe I should preach a different lesson this morning. But I was talking to Chris about it, and she shared with me, reminded me that when her father passed away, who obviously she was close to, but I was likewise very close to, that we went to Indiana from the memorial service, and the man there preached a sermon about life and death, and that was right after his passing. And, he shared with us, he said, I thought about switching the sermon up, and he thought, no, this is the sermon that needs to be preached. And this morning I want to share with you some things as we look at life and death, and I want to think with you about the fact that Jesus led the way for us. Jesus showed us that we don't need to fear death, that there is a resurrection. Sometimes preaching the Word of God, preaching the gospel of Christ is a challenge because you get such a diversity in the audience. You get highly educated people. We had folks in North Florida that literally couldn't read. You get folks that are elderly, you get middle-aged, you get young families, and you get children. And oftentimes I've noticed over the years, it seems like in particular the youngest among us sometimes get overlooked as the preachers prepare lessons. And I will share with you that as a young Christian, I kind of struggled with the book of Ecclesiastes. And I don't know what it's like for you. Some of the books of the Old Testament, as I grew in the faith and studied the Bible, some of the books of the Old Testament were a little difficult for me. And some of you may think about the book of Ecclesiastes and think, well, Mark, it's really not that tough. It's pretty plain. And that's true. And yet somehow it just didn't really come together for me very well. And then one day, I was listening to the radio, and they played a song on the radio from a movie. The movie, of course, was The Lion King. And the song that they played was called The Circle of Life. And I was probably driving at the time, I think, listening to the song, and it just astounded me. I was listening to the song, and I thought, this explains the book of Ecclesiastes. And I want to think about with you for a few minutes this morning some of the lessons in the book of Ecclesiastes and illustrate those lessons with some points from that movie, The Lion King. If you will, think with me about the lyrics from that song for just a moment. This was written by Elton John. Apparently, he's responsible for the lyrics. But the lyrics go like this: from the day we arrive on the planet and blinking step into the sun, there's more to see than can ever be seen, more to do than can ever be done. There's far too much to take in here, more to find than can ever be found. But the sun rolling high through the sapphire sky keeps great and small on the endless round. It's a circle of life. And it moves us all through despair and hope, through faith and love, till we find our place on the path unwinding in the circle of life. The concept of the circle of life is very similar to what the wise man expressed in the book of Ecclesiastes, of course, attributed to Solomon, the wisest man, and I'll say it this way, the wisest natural man that ever lived. As I read this morning, if you will, turn with me to the book of Ecclesiastes. I'm going to be reading passages here from either the King James or the New King James, just because I like these renderings. And this is, of course, in the section of the Old Testament among the wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. The book of Psalms is easy to find because it's so big. Ecclesiastes, and I'm going to start reading it, chapter 3 here. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, starting in verse 16. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, starting in verse 16. The wise man says, moreover, I saw under the sun in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. And in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. And in my heart, and I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. I want to think with you about this idea of the circle of life. And I kind of illustrated it this way. It was just kind of helpful to me to think of it in these terms. But you know, we all come into the life the same way. And God's writer Job said, you know, I came into the world naked, didn't have anything. And we all come into this life that same way. And so we're born into this life, and we're infants. And we grow through being a child into the toddler age. And if God blesses us, we go through childhood. And that's the normal circle of life. That's the normal pattern for life under the sun. And as we grow, we become adolescents. And eventually we start work. Most of us, right? And then adulthood. And then possibly marriage. For most of us, we marry. We choose a mate. We choose a spouse and we marry. And then again, many of us have children. Some don't. It's a little different. But the point is, we all find ourselves generally in some place on this circle. And then at some point, our children grow up and they leave, and we become empty nesters. And then we go through middle age. And then perhaps we become grandparents. And then retirement. And then we leave this life. And that is the circle of life. And that, I think, is what God's writer in the book of Ecclesiastes alludes to in many different ways, talking about life under the sun. For the most part, this is a cycle that's common to us, common to every one of us in life under the sun. There are common experiences, and that the wise man speaks of. There are triumphs, there are tragedies, victories, and loss. And these are common to mankind, common to all of us. Look with me at Ecclesiastes Chapter 1, and I want to read here verses 9 and 10. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 9. That which has been is what will be. And just stop and think about that for a minute. What's he saying? I remember one time as a teenager, I was struggling with some things. And my stepfather told me, he said, Mark, what do you think? You're the only person who's ever had these problems? Everybody deals with these kinds of problems. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? It has already been in ancient times before us. Whatever it is that you're struggling with, whatever it is that you're enjoying as a triumph or a victory in life, others have experienced those same highs and lows. But the really important thing about this circle of life is what happens when it's over. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27, God's writer says that it is appointed unto men once to die, and after this the judgment. You see, what life is about is not really what happens in this circle of life, aside from the fact that this sets us up for what happens after life is over, after we depart the circle, after we leave this realm, after we depart from life under the sun, as the wise man refers to it. That's what's truly important. And so this circle is only important in light of eternity. 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 9, the writer Paul, the Apostle Paul, says, it is written, eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath entered into the heart of man the things which God hath prepared for them that love him. The things after this life are so much greater than what happens in life under the sun. Essentially, God's telling us, He's telling you, He's telling me, there is no comparison. Jesus went to the cross and suffered a terrible death to tell us this here in this life is not what's really important. You think about Abraham. We're told Abraham was looking for a city whose builder and maker was God. And what about you this morning? What about me? Are we looking for that same city? Or are we all wrapped up in the circle of life, not realizing that what's important is what happens afterwards? We can only arrive at that city that Abraham was looking for if we complete the circle in a way that honors God. That's the point of the book of Ecclesiastes. But you see, all of us are involved in life under the sun as long as we're here. All of us share many similar experiences, difficulties, pain, suffering, pleasantries, joy. And the experiences of life we have all in common. But the eternity that each of us will experience after this life is over is dependent on how we live now in life under the sun, in this circle of life. Well, let's unpack this a little bit. Let's think about some of the points from the book of Ecclesiastes. It's pretty profound, really. Sometimes, you meet people in life, and you think, wow, what a handsome dude that is, or what a beautiful woman that is. What a beautiful person. Might be a man or a woman. You just think, oh, they're so handsome or so beautiful. They have so much going for them. They're so successful. They're so good looking. They're so smart. Man, that guy has a great job. His spouse is so attractive or so smart. Her husband, wow, what an accomplished guy that is. They have such a nice house. Even their car, their truck is nice. Or they have a great education. Maybe you know that person over the years. And as you get to know them more and more, you learn that they have beautiful kids. Their kids are so attractive and so smart, or so cute, or so well behaved. And those people really seem to have their act together. Or they just seem so successful. And then maybe you know them through the years, and one day you find out that their family lives were really terrible tragedies. Or they both get some terrible disease and die. Or you find out that they've lived secret lives and they really have been miserable and lost and lonely and unhappy all those years. You thought they were so successful. Perhaps one was a drunk and they both struggled with that. Or perhaps one or both had drug problems and they both struggled with that. Or perhaps one or both had a problem with pornography. Or maybe one or both were embezzling from their employer. They get caught, they get arrested, they do jail time. Perhaps as they grow older, their children are alienated from them, or perhaps their children become rebellious, or perhaps their children die at a young age. Or perhaps, I'm going to suggest very, 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 very rarely, they really did live nice lives. Maybe they did live to a pleasant old age, and so do their children. And then they die. But you see, the point of the wise man is the end is the same to all. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is how we handle our time here in this life now and life under the sun. Ecclesiastes Chapter 3 and verse 20. Ecclesiastes Chapter 3 and verse 20. Like I said, keep your finger here in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 20. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and all return to the dust. It doesn't matter how great your life is now or how terrible your life is now. The end is the same. And what's important is what happens after we leave this life. Look at Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 15. Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 15. As he came forth of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came, and shall take nothing of his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. And Job, of course, expressed this sentiment. I alluded to it earlier, but Job 1 and verse 21, Job said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. You remember the occasion when Job said that? It's pretty amazing, really. Satan went before God and said, actually God held out Job as an example, but Satan said, the only reason that he honors you, God, is because you've made a hedge around him. Let me at him, and he'll curse you to your face. And so God allowed Satan to afflict Job. You know how many kids Job had? 7 children. Did you remember that all 7 of Job's children died in the same day? Can you imagine? Imagine how difficult it is to lose one child. He lost all 7 of his children in one day. Lost many of his servants. Lost all of his wealth. He lost everything. And then Satan took his health away from him. And his wife turned on him. You remember what his wife said? Why don't you just curse God and die? These were the things that Job went through. And yet that was his attitude. I came into this world with nothing, and I'm going to leave this world with nothing. The Lord gave, the Lord had taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That was Job's attitude. And then back to the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 12. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 7. Ecclesiastes 12 and verse 7. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. It's not my intent to be morbid about these things, and I don't believe that God is being morbid in giving us the book of Ecclesiastes. It's not my intention to be discouraging, quite the contrary. It's my intention to help each of us, myself included, to consider the reality of life, to consider what's really important in life, to help us to consider the brevity of life. Remember we said earlier, some don't even grow into adulthood. Some are lost in their youth. Some are lost in infancy. What's important is what life is really, really about. What's really important, what's really worthwhile are the things that happen after this life is over. And what happens in life is only important in light of that. I'm going to quote an authority source. Bugs Bunny, the cartoon character. It was Bugs Bunny who jokingly screamed in a cartoon, "We're all going to die. Nobody gets out of here alive." For some reason that came to me years and years ago. I remembered that from that cartoon. I think he was in an airplane and the airplane was crashing. And he yells, "We're all going to die. Nobody gets out of here alive." And I thought, words of wisdom to contemplate from a cartoon character. What's important is what happens after. Life is an opportunity for us to learn to serve God and the people around us. And that's what's important. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 and 14. The conclusion. And the wise man calls it the conclusion. Verse 13 of Ecclesiastes 12. Solomon says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." And so as we think about the circle of life, nobody gets out of here alive. And that, by the way, that ending doesn't matter if you're rich, if you're poor, you're in between. Something else that I think we should learn as we consider the book of Ecclesiastes has to do with envy in life under the sun. And I want to share something with you, and if you've never thought on this, I want to encourage you to think about it. This is something that's very important, and particularly for the young people among us to think about. If you're in school, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, think about this. When I was in high school, I had one best friend. His name was Guy. He was like a brother to me. I think we sort of helped each other to make it through school. But as time went by, I went through a stage in high school when I admired and really envied some of the other kids. They were beautiful kids. They were popular kids. They were the in crowd. They were handsome, they were beautiful, they were well liked by all the other kids, by the teachers, by the adults. They were the kids who were athletic, the kids who seemed so successful. They did well in school. I went to a school where whites were in the minority. I was in Hawaii, and the Chinese kids always ruined the curve in the math class because they just did better than the rest of us. It was a struggle. I thought about the guys who always seemed to get the beautiful girls, the girls who always seemed to get the handsome, good-looking guys. And I remember running for the bus in the morning because I had a pimple on my face, and I'm trying to, fix it somehow. And you can't fix a pimple when you got a pimple on your nose or on your chin. You can't fix that, really. It's just there. It was a struggle, and it is a struggle for all of us. And my friend, Guy, saw what I was thinking, and he heard my complaints and my sorrows. You know what he said to me? He said, Mark, don't envy those other kids. Most of those kids who seem to have it made are not happy. Most of those kids have problems worse than anything that you could even imagine. And when he told me that, I thought, yeah, right. But what I learned over the years is that was exactly the case. He was right. Nobody has it easy. Most people have lots of problems. And you will find that most people have much worse problems than you do. Even the kids who seem to have it made, especially the kids that seem to have it made. You see, we're all in the circle of life, and we all have challenges and difficulties. And envy is a dangerous thing. God's writer Job said this, Job 5 and verse 2, "Wrath killeth the foolish man, and envy slayeth the silly one." Wrath and envy will kill you. It's not good to look at others and be envious or be jealous. And it's, in fact, as Job said, it's foolish. We are all in the same circle of life. We all have similar challenges and difficulties. In Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 17, Solomon says this, Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 17, "I said in mine heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work." And again, Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 20, "All go into one place. All are of the dust, and all turn to dust again." We all share common frailties, pleasures, and difficulties. And we all get pimples on our nose or chin. Sometimes we all want to be loved. Sometimes we'll win in love. Sometimes we'll lose in love. But that's the circle of life. That's what it means to be in life under the sun. And there's no reason to envy others. And as we think about that, talking about youth in particular, what is youth really about? Again, if left to the natural processes of time, humans are born. They grow from infancy into childhood, through childhood into adolescence, from adolescence to adulthood, into old age, into extreme old age, and then we die physically. That's the normal process. What is this youth really about? Look with me at Ecclesiastes Chapter 11, and I want to start reading here at verse 7. Ecclesiastes 11, starting at verse 7. Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 7. Solomon says, "Truly the light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to behold the sun. But if a man lives many years and rejoices in them all, yet let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. All that is coming is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these God will bring you into judgment. Therefore remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh. For childhood and youth are vanity." In our youth, we have the opportunity to learn about life and what's really important in life. In our youth, we have the opportunity to get our lives right with our God. And you know, for some of us, it takes longer than others. But it's an ongoing effort, an ongoing process. But the question is, are you making that effort? Are you working to get your life right with God? And particularly in your youth. Something else that we need to understand, there's a picture, I guess, from the Lion King. Youth, right? Frivolity of youth. But we need to understand about sin. Sin results in death. We're talking about life under the sun. And in the circle of life, we need to understand that. Romans chapter 6 and verse 23, the wages of sin is death. But the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. And you know, Peter, I believe it was Peter, likened sin to a mud hole. In a sense, I think it was Peter talked about the pig wallowing in the mire. But sin is like that. Sin is like a mud hole that we jump in and we get ourselves dirty. When we disobey God, we pollute our minds and our hearts, and we bring on ourselves the guilt of sin, and that guilt covers us like a coating of mud. God hates sin. We need to look at sin the way that God does. God doesn't laugh at sin. God hates it. He abhors sin. Will we choose to cover ourselves with it? To jump into a mud hole of sin? It's not a pretty picture. Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, Paul says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Should we just keep sinning so God can forgive us more? God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? We need to turn from sin, to turn away from sin. And as we do that, God's willing to take us back. He's willing to wash us. But would we then jump back in the mud? God says that the pig who doesn't know any better, you wash him, you clean him up, get him all spiffy, and he goes right back to wallowing in the mire, wallowing in the mud. And are we as foolish as that pig? The wages of sin is death. That's a serious, serious thing. God says the pig, doesn't know any better. But we ought to. Something else that we get from the book of Ecclesiastes, and that is that sometimes bad things happen to good people. Have you thought about that? Have you noticed that sometimes life gets hard? Harder for some than for others. But for all of us, sometimes life gets difficult. Sometimes life is really, really tough. Sometimes really bad things happen to good people. And when difficulties come our way, it feels like you're the only one in the world that has experienced that difficulty. But the things that happen to you will happen to others. And they have happened to others. That was the point that my stepfather was trying to get across to me so many years ago. I'm not the only one that's had these difficulties. You're not the only one that's had to suffer those things. Perhaps not in exactly the same way others have suffered those things, but difficult nonetheless. Do you have difficulties? This is a passage that's been really helpful to me over the years. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. Paul makes this point, that these experiences, these difficulties are common to all. But he makes some additional points for us to understand and to learn. Paul says, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. Well, that's pretty comforting to me. And I want to suggest to you there's three really important things that we need to see in that. First of all, everybody has difficulties. It gets tough for everybody sometimes. This is common to man. But God promises that you won't be tested, you won't be tried beyond your ability to resist. And God promises that there will be a way to escape. I remember a story years ago. I think his name was Jerry Lucas. He was a pretty well-known basketball player. But he proclaimed himself to be a Christian. And yet he was in the NBA, and it was pretty tough because there was a lot of bad things going on, immorality among the ball players. And I remember he told the story one time about how he got invited to a party, like a big penthouse party, all hoity-toity and all this stuff. And he opened the door and walked into the room, and he realized that his teammates were there, and there were a lot of loose women, prostitutes, loose women. There was drinking going on, there was drugs, there was all kinds of bad stuff. And he walked into the middle of the room, and he saw what was going on around him, and he literally turned around and ran out of the room, slammed the door behind him, and kept running. A way of escape. He didn't have to stay. He knew there were temptations at that party. And he said, you know what? I don't want to be here. I was pretty impressed when I heard that. It was probably pretty embarrassing. His friends are probably poo-pooing him. What'd you do, Jerry? Can't hack it? I don't want to be around that. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, right before the passage that we're looking at here, God's writer says this. He says, wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. You better not pass up that way of escape. God promises to make it available. But in the circle of life, bad things sometimes happen to all of us. And something else that's really important for us to understand, the great men and women of faith that went on before us, they suffered terrible things, terrible difficulties, terrible trials. If you will, turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11. I want to take a minute to read through this because it's significant. It's important to understand this. When I have difficulties, I think about being sawn in two in a log, which history indicates the prophet Isaiah had happened to him. I think it's alluded to in this passage, though not specifically. But the terrible things that God's people in ancient times had to suffer. Hebrews chapter 11, starting at verse 32. And what more shall I say? Of course, the Hebrew writing here speaking. For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. By the way, you know what that requires? If you're going to stop the mouth of a lion, it means a lion has to be there. And you have to be vulnerable to the lion. And basically, the lion's in attack mode, and then you stop the mouth of the lion. And of course, he could be alluding to Daniel, the prophet, who was thrown into the lion's den, or he could be talking about David, who said that he protected his sheep in the fields, and that he'd killed both the lion and the bear. Verse 34, these have quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong. How do you get strong? You get strong by sitting on the sofa? No, you get strong by being tested, by trying, by being tried. These became valiant in battle, turned to flight the enemies of the aliens. Women received their dead, raised to life again. You think about how difficult that is to lose a loved one, and then their loved one was raised back to life. What a wonderful thing, but how difficult to lose a loved one. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. See, they weren't thinking about the torture. Jesus wasn't thinking about the cross. He was looking beyond the cross to what lay beyond it. These likewise were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. That means killed with stones. People throw stones at you till you die. They were sawn in two. They were tempted. They were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. God's people that went before us, they suffered terrible things. But you see, difficulties give us the opportunity to show ourselves faithful. And that's one of the great lessons that we need to learn from these women and men who went on before us. So what is life really about? I think about Jesus. I think about Jesus, when we think about the circle of life, Jesus didn't have the benefit of going through that entire circle. You recall that he was put to death at about the age of 33. He didn't have the opportunity, the blessing to marry. He didn't have the opportunity to have children, to bounce his grandchildren on his knees, to live through old age. He gave that up for you, for me. And again, he gave that up to show us that what happens in life under the sun is not the important thing. What is life really about? Life is really about what happens after this life is over. Look with me at Ecclesiastes 12. Again, verses 13 and 14. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing. You think you're getting away with something? You're not. Whether it be good or whether it be evil, we're going to be called into judgment for those things that we do in life under the sun. And back to verse 11 here in Ecclesiastes 12. The words of the wise are as goads and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. God is trying to instruct us about life. He's trying to teach us, and He used the wise man in writing the book of Ecclesiastes to goad us, to give us some nails that we can cling to hang on, really, as it were. Well, as we think about the circle of life, and we think about life under the sun this morning, we talk about what's really important in life under the sun. The question is to you and to me. Are you prepared to serve God, to keep His commandments, to do those things that God has told us to do? Will you live the way that God has instructed us to live? Do you even know what God's commandments are? How can you obey God if you don't know what God requires and expects of you? Where are you going to go for that knowledge? You going to ask the preacher? You going to ask a priest? You going to go read it in some self-help book? God has given us a handbook for life. He's told us how to live. He's told us what He's done, what He expects from us. He created us. And He sent His Son into the world. He wants to have fellowship with you, with me. But sin results in death. And when we sin against God, when we disobey God, it separates us from Him. But God is willing to take us back. The wages of sin is death. Jesus died so that He could be the propitiation for your sin and mine, so that He could die in our place. But in order for Him to be my propitiation and yours, for Him to be in our stead, we have to be obedient to Him. And the Scriptures tell us, the New Testament tells us, we have to believe that Jesus is the Christ. And believing, we have to be willing to turn from sin. We have to be willing to confess Christ before people. And we have to be buried in the waters of baptism to be raised in newness of life. Just like the body of Jesus was put in the tomb for 3 days and was raised to newness of life, we go under the water, hopefully not for 3 days, Brendan, but we go under the water and then we're raised to newness of life, because that's God's instruction in the matter. You know, sometimes I think about it, I think, well, it kind of doesn't make sense to me, but God said to do it, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to live that way. This morning, if you've never rendered obedience to the gospel of Christ, you have an opportunity to do that. If you have obeyed the gospel in times past and you're not living your life right, take the steps that you need to take to get your life right. I promise you, if you live your life the way God says to live it, your life will be so much better here now in life under the sun. And there's a great reward prepared. And Jesus died to show us that. This morning, if we can help you in any way at all, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that was selected.